What's up, Comm fam? So this is the fourth and final short lecture from Chapter 1 in your textbook. And in this short lecture, we're going to talk about framing theories of organizational comm. So one of the theories of organizational communication that we focus on here is what's called functionalism. Now, people who practice functionalism believe that progress and emancipation is sort of a fancy word for freedom, can best be achieved through a process of discovery, right, learning, in which the application of scientific principles gradually and progressively illuminates the world. Now, this is a very modern kind of way of looking at things. So people who believe or practice functionalism believe that the key to progress and human freedom it can only be, can only be achieved through learning that's based in science. And this constitutes what we call a teleological paradigm. Now, these are two fancy words. So paradigm is just a way of thinking, and teleological is a word that describes a process that's going somewhere, that's going towards a goal, building on itself. So putting together Legos to make a great big Lego castle is in itself a teleological process. It's a progression, right? You're working towards a final goal. And so according to people who practice functionalism, they believe that scientific understanding is the key to this, right? Rationality. Sherlock Holmes is sort of the perfect example if you've ever read or watched any of the Sherlock Holmes stories, right? Sherlock Holmes uses logic, deduction, and science in order to solve crimes, right? And so this kind of thinking has dominated much of the research in organizational communication for decades, right? And it's related to the field of social sciences that believe, if you're a social scientist, a social psychologist, for example, you believe that you can examine the way people behave scientifically in order to figure out how societies work, how people work, right? That's a functionalist viewpoint. So, according to functionalism, communication is thought of as the means by which internal thoughts and knowledge about the world can be expressed and shared. And according to the functionalists, talking about the world and the actual world are two separate entities, right? So you see how this is a little different than what we talked about in the last short lecture, right? So for a functionalist, they don't believe that communication, for example, makes an organization, because communication and the real world, quote unquote, are two very separate things, right? And so they believe in what we would call sort of a linear model of communication. The linear model was originally conceived of by two academics named Shannon and Weaver, and so this is sometimes called the Weaver model or the Shannon and Weaver model. And so this is just the straight line sort of linear process of communication, where you have one person who transmits an idea, right, over a channel, which might be their voice, for example. The message is received by the person they're talking to, right, and they make sense of it. And along the way, there can be noise or interference that gets in the way. But we know that this model is really too simplistic in some ways. And we'll talk more about that as the semester progresses. So another model of understanding is what we call interpretivism. And in this interpretive model, we understand that communication, talking, right, or communicating through nonverbal means, is what actually makes up the world. And so for an interpretist, it's tough to separate the physical world and just talking about the world. Interpretivists believe that humans create reality when they interact together. And so there's a close connection between communication and social reality. Again, like I talked about previously, right? I don't want to go as far as to say that communication makes the world, right? But it does make your world. And we know that for a variety of reasons. As I talk about in my interpersonal communication class, your whole idea of self, scientists have studied people and the way they interact, and we know, for example, that if you grow up without any people around you, if you're born and you're raised by wolves in the woods, right, and you're never around any people, you won't have any sense of self. You won't think of yourself in terms of I, right? We found people who have been raised in the wild and never met a person, right? The wild boy of Aveyron is an example, right? This kid that they found in France, a little over 100 years ago, who had come out of the woods and never seen another person. And what they discovered was he had no sense of self. He didn't know who he was in a very literal way. He didn't think of himself like, I'm hungry, right? He didn't think of I. He couldn't think of that. So what we know from that, what we can deduce from that, is that our very idea of self is shaped by other people, by communication with other people. So in some ways it seems really far-fetched to say that communication makes reality, but it really does in a way, right? Because it makes the most fundamental unit of reality. Your understanding of yourself is made through communication. So, of course, according to this idea, right, the talking, communication, discourse, right? Discourse is just a fancy word for communication, is fundamental to organizational culture studies, right? Communication equals organizations, right? That's what the interpretivists believe. And so, in terms of reality, they'll tell you, too, even if there is a real world that's separate from communication, the only world that we can know is the symbolic world, right? I mean, the reality is that you can't really observe the real world, right? It's always mediated, right? You can only see, hear, feel, taste, and smell the world, right? And that doesn't represent accurately what all is out there. There are various electromagnetic waves in the air, for example, that you can't see, hear, feel, touch, or smell, but they're out there, baby, right? So you can't really ever know the real world. So for interpretivists, they say, well, since you can't know the world anyway, right, let's just talk about the symbolic world because that's the only one we can know. And so at this point, usually if we were in class, I'd ask you, what do you think? And this is where I bring up my example that I bring up in many classes, and that's the idea that you can't even think without language. Well, go ahead, try and think without words. You can't do it, right? As soon as you start to think like, oh, I'm gonna think without words, as soon as you think that thought, you've already used words. You're fucked. You can't get past it, right? And that's what interpretivists say, right? Is that words, language, communication is the only way that we can know the world. Finally, we get to critical theory. So critical theorists believe that different social groups have different levels of access to resources. And so the way reality gets constructed reflects the ability of powerful groups to shape this process. So we're taking a critical approach to organizational communication this semester. And what that means is we're interested in how powerful groups communicate in order to shape people's organizational reality. We're interested in power. Who's got the power in an organizational structure? And so as a result, critical researchers ask themselves questions about how meaning systems are created through communication, right? Through communication and symbolic practices, and how these meanings in turn either sustain or resist certain organizational power relations. That's just a fancy word of saying we're interested in how the people in power communicate and make you communicate and behave in ways that keep them in power. That's what we're interested in, right? And it's not just a question of rules, right? Obvious rules in a rule book. And an example might be, how do Christmas parties operate to reassert the worldview of the management in an organization, right? There are rules and practices and rituals that we engage in all the time that help to maintain the power structure. And Christmas parties would be an example that we could talk about later in the semester. So we take a critical approach. Now, another approach is a postmodern approach. And postmodernism is a fancy way of thinking that really caught traction in the 1960s and sort of progressed since then. And postmodernism sort of challenges the modernist belief that reason and science help humankind. Indeed, some of the people in the postmodern school say that reason and science have hurt us more than they've helped us. And an example of this might be the concentration camps in Germany during the Second World War. You couldn't have Auschwitz or Treblinka or Buchenwald, these camps where people were murdered systematically in a factory-like setting without the Industrial Revolution, without reason and science, right? So we took the assembly line, or the Germans took the assembly line of Henry Ford and used it to murder Jewish people and gay people and gypsies and crippled people, right? Across the board. And so they used these techniques that were enabled by modernity, that gave us all these wonderful things like iPhones and cars and all these things, and applied it to mass destruction and killing. And so the postmodernists argue, well, maybe that's not the best way to look at it, right? And in fact, they say there are lots of ways of looking at the world, and as a result, there are a lot of different realities. So a postmodernist, for example, questions the idea that there are certain books that you need to read in English class, or that there are certain books that you need to read in communication class, right? They question the canon. They assert that there is no one big narrative or story that describes where we're at as people, right? They reject the idea, for example, for a long time, for centuries, if not millennia, you could say that Christianity was the overarching narrative of the West, right? Everybody believed in Jesus. The Catholic Church was the most powerful organization in the world, arguably at the time, certainly in the Western world. And so that was the grand narrative. And they say there is no narrative like that today. Everybody's kind of doing their own thing. And so what they say is, the world itself is secondary to communication. There's nothing outside the text, as Derrida said, right? There's only communication. There's no right or wrong necessarily. There's just discourse. Now, another way that we can approach this, of course, is feminism, and we'll talk a little bit about that this semester too, right? And feminism maintains that organizations have been blind and deaf to issues of gender over time, and that research is not focused on these issues, and that they're important. That women's voices have been excluded from organizational life, which they were for long periods of time, and they're really interested in research that focuses on gender power in organization. They ask questions like, how does communication create gendered identities in the workplace, right? All right, so that's it for this short lecture, and that's it for Chapter 1. Thanks for checking these out.